Sometime between now and the end of this year, the Ryukyu Islands, which trail off the south of Japan, will welcome a contingent of the United States Marine Corps equipped with HIMARS, or High Mobility Artillery Rocket Systems. The reason for this deployment is the larger island, which serves as a sort of full stop at the end of the Ryukyu ellipsis, Taiwan. The only imaginable reason for the HIMARS is to protect Taiwan, or at least communicate the impression that the US is willing, should it become necessary, to do exactly that. The extremely concise version of Taiwan's difficulty is as follows. In 1949, the island was the last redoubt of the defeated side in the Chinese Civil War. Since then, Taiwan has effectively, in both senses of that word, functioned as an independent state. Since emerging from military dictatorship in the 1980s, Taiwan has become a flourishing democracy and an industrial powerhouse, by some estimates perhaps the world's 20th biggest economy. However, China still officially regards Taiwan as a temporarily rogue province, and in recent years especially has been decreasingly subtle about its ambitions of retrieving it, and increasingly irked by Taiwan's more independent-minded leaders. This weekend, President Lai Ching-te of Taiwan is touring the Pacific, including stops on the US territory of Guam and the US state of Hawaii. Some China watchers believe that President Xi Jinping sees Taiwan as the bedrock of his legacy. They anxiously circle such dates as 2027, the centenary of the People's Liberation Army. Would China really do it? How prepared is Taiwan? And is the best resolution of the crisis no resolution at all? This is the Foreign Desk.
To a lot of them, they felt like the sense of urgency and desire that the younger generation and the current ruling party is trying to really highlight that unique Taiwan identity and the separation of Taiwan and China is something that they feel very uneasy about.
If China really decide to launch an invasion, they might try to launch as quick as possible and as sure as possible before a so-called foreign force, particularly the United States, will get involved.
For the people of Taiwan, it's Xi Jinping who's changing the status quo. He's the one threatening. And it's very important that other countries in the world understand the stakes.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller, and our first guest is William Yang, a journalist based in Taipei. William, first of all, I want to get a sense of the degree to which all this is a part of everyday life and everyday conversation in Taiwan. Is the threat from China something people do talk about, or has everyone just kind of tuned it out by now?
I think Taiwanese people are mostly at a state in between those two situations. On the one hand, because of the very large amount of media coverage on the day-to-day Chinese military operations in areas around Taiwan, and also because of the fact that the Taiwanese Defense Ministry has begun to start to release the daily Chinese military activity around Taiwan to the general public. And so I think that is always going to put the issue on the back of everyone's mind. But at the same time, I don't think most Taiwanese people are so alarmed by the degree and the frequency of those activities that they feel the need to constantly bring that topic up at their everyday conversation. But I think because of the government's efforts of informing the Taiwanese people about the Chinese military activities around Taiwan, so the general awareness about what is going on in the waters and the airspace around Taiwan is pretty high among the Taiwanese people.
Is it something people make active preparations for? Do people have plans just in case something happens or looks like it's about to happen?
When it comes to that, I would say, in general, most Taiwanese people are not really thinking about the invasion or military attack scenario just yet, because I think we have been living under the similar kind of threat for decades. And so to a lot of Taiwanese people, they just believe that this delicate balance that has been in place for the last almost 30 years is something that they just have to live with. And they don't see any alarming development that will suggest that they need to really start actively preparing for such a scenario.
You mentioned that Taiwanese leadership, Taiwanese government is being more, I guess, frank about what they see as escalations or provocations by the People's Republic. But does anybody much in Taiwanese politics talk about some sort of definitive solution to this standoff? Or do you get the sense that there is kind of a consensus maybe among Taiwanese politicians that Taiwan's best chance is just to keep avoiding any resolution and maybe hope something changes down the road?
I think most Taiwanese politicians agree with the fact that there's no immediate solution and probably there's no pathway for Taiwan to really seek a definitive resolution to the great area and the great space that Taiwan's status has been in for the last several 6-7 decades, because of the fact that the Chinese military capabilities have been increasing exponentially over the last decade. And at the same time, the global geopolitical situation is becoming more and more uncertain and unpredictable. And so rather than seeing an opportunity, for example, to suggest that Taiwan would receive the majority of the global countries' support if it decides to announce official independence. Rather, they felt like China's growing global influence is suggesting that most countries will be opposing Taiwan to go down that path. And so in order for Taiwan to maintain as much of the autonomy that it has right now, it's better for Taiwan to remain in the current status, which is that it's a de facto democracy, it's a de facto sovereign country, but at the same time, there is not enough global support that will allow Taiwan to take that final step to become a real sovereign country.
How much of a factor is that generation gap between Taiwanese people over 50 and Taiwanese people under 50, which I guess is kind of the difference between Taiwanese people who can remember when Taiwan wasn't a multi-party democracy and Taiwanese people who've never really known anything else? Is that an important shift in how younger Taiwanese people see themselves, do you think?
Yes, definitely. For example, I was born in the year of 1989. That was just 2 years after the martial law was being lifted. So essentially, I have always lived in a Taiwan that is a multi-party democracy. I personally witnessed the first presidential election in 1996. And so to me, and a lot of the Taiwanese people around my age or younger, the idea that Taiwan is not a democracy just doesn't register. And so to them, they already felt like in their memory, Taiwan has always been a sovereign country. But at the same time, for people, my parents' generation or older, they went through the whole struggle. They sometimes felt like before the martial law was being lifted, Taiwan was maybe, in fact, even more stable than it is right now. So they don't necessarily, and they see the chaos that the transition to democracy and the efforts to remain as a democracy has brought to Taiwan. So to a lot of them, they felt like the sense of urgency and desire that the younger generation and the current ruling party is trying to really highlight that unique Taiwan identity and the separation of Taiwan and China is something that they feel very uneasy about. And so that's why more of the people in their generation or slightly younger, or basically more of the people above the age of 40 maybe, will think that electing a party that maybe will adopt a less confrontational or less, I think, Taiwan-led type of approach to manage and run the island is their preference.
William, just finally, one of the reasons we're doing this episode is, of course, that there is an upcoming change of administration in the United States, which has generally been seen as Taiwan's protector of last resort, with all due respect to the concept of strategic ambiguity. Taiwan is obviously, of course, not alone in the world in wondering if it's about to be abandoned by the United States. But for Taiwan, of course, that's maybe a more existential question than it is in other places. Is that something people are concerned about?
I think with the track record and the style of Donald Trump, there's definitely a sense of uneasiness among Taiwanese people regarding whether the U.S. will remain as committed as it has been under the Biden administration regarding the commitment to potentially coming to Taiwan's defense if China ever really launches a military attack against Taiwan. Because I think the rhetorics that Trump has been presenting on the campaign trails regarding the protection fee, regarding Taiwan stealing the U.S. semiconductor technology, and also just the fact that he is not in favor of maintaining alliance, and rather he is more in favor of a transactional approach towards managing the U.S. relations with other countries, including with China. So that definitely, I think, is bringing a sense of unpredictability to most Taiwanese people when it comes to their views on Taiwan's relationship with the United States. But I think because of the current government's effort to repeatedly convince and reassure the Taiwanese public, there's not a general, panic feeling among Taiwanese people. But I would definitely say that most Taiwanese people will be keeping a very close eye on the Trump administration's Taiwan policy once they take office in January.
That was William Yang in Taipei. This is the Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio with me, Andrew Mueller. Any attempt by China to take Taiwan by force would be a necessarily monumental endeavour, certainly the biggest seaborne invasion anywhere since the Chinese communists took the island of Hainan from forces loyal to the Republic of China, as Taiwan is now otherwise known, at the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1950. For a look at the military reality of the present situation, I'm joined now by Arthur Ding, Director of the Institute of International Relations at National Chengchi University in Taipei. Arthur, first of all, does it look to you like China's military, its army, navy and air force, are all preparing for the operation that they would need to undertake to recover, as they see it, Taiwan?
Well, there's no doubt in the past 3 decades, particularly after 1995, 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, China intensifies so-called military modernization, and they make tremendous investment in R&D and develop and deploy new so-called weapon systems. And after 2015-16, Xi Jinping undertook, I would say, unprecedented another reform to overhaul, totally transform its so-called command structure. So, no doubt, now these days we talk about asymmetric development between Taiwan and China, implies that China, in terms of military size, and China in the past 2 or 3 years, China launched all kinds of military actions. What someone called gray zone behavior or so-called coercive action, so on and so forth. The goal is to gradually eroding our morale or exhaust our resources, so on and so forth. So, there's no doubt internationally people worry about the kind of imminent large-scale invasion. But in fact, what we really see is that, more intensive coercive action around Taiwan. When China will launch so-called large-scale military invasion, we don't know. But when the signal to see will China really launch large-scale invasion is about the logistics, because it takes tremendous resources. So far, we don't see any signal or signs that China is fully prepared for large-scale invasion. We don't see that kind of a preparation yet. So maybe many of us speculate probably in the next, let's say, 1 or 2 years, China continue to undertake the so-called coercive action against us.
There's a couple of points there about what you described as grey zone activity that I do want to pick up on. Does that strike you as maybe the likelier short-term strategy by China to just continue harassing, pestering Taiwan, even up to the point of establishing some sort of quarantine or blockade, which could make, a lot of aspects of Taiwan's life just incredibly difficult?
Yeah, as I said earlier, that there's no doubt this kind of a coercive action really brings some kind of a negative impact on us, frankly speaking. As I said, it exhausts our resources or, divide our society, and maybe, with this kind of social division, the impact our so-called social morale, so on and so forth. There's no doubt about that. So that's why we are in Taiwan these days, we talk about how should we build our so-called resilience. We know that this kind of a coercive action probably will continue in the probably, let's say, next 1 or 2 years before China really so-called fully prepare for launch so-called large-scale military invasion.
But on the subject of those preparations for the large-scale military invasion, is there any consensus on how large a scale China thinks it would need to be? A seaborne invasion is a hugely complex military undertaking, especially when you're trying to take an entire hostile island. Is there any consensus over how many troops China would need to commit to an operation like that?
These days, people talk about the Ukraine war and try to project the Ukraine war to the Taiwan Strait. But I would say one major difference is that China probably cannot afford to have this kind of invasion protracted for too long, because if invasion has been protracted too long, then they will create a so-called the internal crisis for Chinese Communist Party's leadership or Xi Jinping's leadership, so on and so forth. So what we assume in Taiwan that how it's different from Ukraine war is that if China really decide to launch an invasion, they might try to launch as quick as possible and as short as possible before a so-called foreign force, particularly the United States, will get involved. So that's why if China really want to launch a so quick, short invasion, then the so-called large-scale invasion, they probably have to prepare, tremendous resources and for the logistical purpose.
You did say that there's no definite indications yet that any of this is imminent, but what do you think is likelier? Is it you could almost say a Pearl Harbor-style surprise attack, or would China go to the trouble more likely of creating some sort of pretext, like giving themselves a reason to do it? Again,
it's of the issue of debate, I would say. Previously, China set a condition, for instance, if Taiwan so-called make a formal announcement of so-called Taiwan independent, okay, or Taiwan developed so-called nuclear weapon, or the Taiwan-U.S. rebuild the so-called diplomatic relations, so on and so forth. So those are the conditions previously set by the Chinese leader. But I would say some of these conditions has changed. For instance, we see more frequent close Taiwan-U.S. military relationship. United States provides more kind of a military training for our military force. So those are the political conditions, I would say, for China launch so-called the large-scale military actions. Another issue is that aside from the large-scale military invasion, we also debate, for instance, will China launch so-called quarantine or blockade? Or another possibility is that the so-called because these days in the past 2 years, the size of China's military exercise has been expanded tremendously. So can we assume that one day China launch large-scale military exercise to mobilize as many force as possible, and in a very short term convert so-called military exercise become into a kind of invasion or not? So those are the new development we have seen, and we internally discuss about that. But again, we don't have definite answer because all decision has been made by Xi Jinping and his colleagues.
That was Arthur Ding of the National Cheng-Chi University in Taipei. This is the Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio, and finally on today's show, Taiwan's existential dilemma is captured in a new documentary called Invisible Nation, featuring extensive interviews with Taiwan's previous president, Tsai Ing-wen. And joining me now here in the studio is the director of that film, Venessa Hope. Venessa, first of all, to a question of filmmaking logistics, how do you go about persuading the actual president, as she then was, to take part?
It began, I think, with the first film I directed, looking at the U.S.-China diplomatic relationship. People on her team had seen it and appreciated that there was no voiceover narration, that I simply allowed the people involved in diplomacy to discuss whether it was national security, human rights, or economics, and kind of understanding that relationship, which is so critical to the job of any president of Taiwan. And not sure anyone else was really trying to make this movie. I happened to be there when President Tsai won. I had just finished that first film, and I knew it was possible Taiwan might elect their first female president. So I joined an international delegation to monitor that the elections were free and fair. Really, that was just a way to get to Taipei and be there with a camera crew and film. And once I witnessed her win and felt the excitement in the crowd and knew how historic it was, and then witnessed that screen behind her on the stage blaring, "We are Taiwanese," I knew there was a huge story and I had to find a way to follow it. And so I wrote a proposal and I earned a grant, which was to focus on women, peace, and security. And I think that the president's office also liked that angle. And then we waited the requisite 6 months after submitting the proposal to her office. Her team invited us to come and film other interviews. This was in April 2017. And we did, and the very last day before I was set to leave, we were invited to the presidential office building, and our team and her team sat down together. President Tsai came in last, sat at the head of the table, listened, left first, stood at the door, looked back at all of us, nodded her head to her team, quickly left and closed the door, and her team erupted in excitement, and then we knew, okay, this is happening. And they said, come back in 2 weeks, opened her schedule for a month. I think none of us knew what we were getting into. And they maybe thought, 5 weeks, that's all you need. I mean, yes, if it was a fiction film, that would be luxurious. But in documentary land, you need to see what's happening and how events unfold and how much access you get. And every single trip I did make to Taipei, every time I wanted an interview with the president, it was only granted the day before I was scheduled to leave the country. So something about my not being a permanent resident there, I think, helped in making the film.
The film does do a remarkably good job, though, I guess, of communicating the central dilemma faced by anybody trying to do that job, which is that she wants, as any Taiwanese president does, to advocate for Taiwan, to underpin its legitimacy as a nation on the world stage. But there's a limit they know they can only walk up to, isn't there? What was your sense of how aware she was of where that limit is, the things she can't quite say?
I think she was extremely brave, and I think she was really one of Taiwan's first presidents to speak up for Taiwan's sovereignty, to advocate for it in ways that it hasn't been advocated for on the world stage before.
In what kind of ways specifically?
I mean, from the beginning, when I was there in January 2016, and there was a Taiwanese pop star in a Korean band who was being forced to apologize for having had a Taiwanese flag in a music video. And President Tsai, this is before the election, before the voting, she was out there and she spoke up for this woman, Cho Zu-yu, and she said, this is wrong. I mean, for this 16-year-old to make a confession for the Chinese Communist Party and say, yes, I'm so sorry, I admit that Taiwan is part of China, blah, blah, blah. And President Tsai said, no, that's not okay. She's a Taiwanese woman. She has every right to stand up for her country and to have her flag in a music video. So I think it just started early, and the longer President Tsai served, the more she did speak up in critical ways. I mean, in her second term, you had the protests in Hong Kong, you had COVID, and you had Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The stakes got increasingly high. And frankly, I mean, actually from the beginning, if you're a China nerd as I am, you know, in 2019, when Xi Jinping made the speech to the people of Taiwan, that was the first time a leader of China had made a speech to the people of Taiwan in 40 years. And he said he would not renounce the use of force. So she had the stakes were high from the beginning for her.
But when you spoke to the president and to other people involved in the government, and Foreign Minister Joseph Wu, who's been a guest on this show a couple of times, also does appear, is your sense that they want the situation resolved, that they would like just this to be sorted out forever, for Taiwan to be a normal country, or are they realistic enough to understand that probably their best chance is for the situation to stay unresolved?
Absolutely. President Tsai is known for maintaining the status quo, the idea of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, meaning that Taiwan is not being provocative. They are not seeking a declaration of independence. They, as President Tsai said, are a de facto independent country. And I think that for the people of Taiwan, it's Xi Jinping who's changing the status quo. He's the one threatening. And it's very important that other countries in the world understand the stakes, because whoever starts the war, if there is some terrible situation of an invasion or a blockade, anything along those lines, the United States will only get involved if Taiwan does not start it. So,
but among Taiwan's leadership, or the Taiwanese leadership you met, is there any concern about how manageable this is in the longer term? Because one thing the film does make clear, and this was certainly my experience of Taiwan on my one visit, and that was going back 20 years, and I'm sure things have changed since, but the younger the Taiwanese you spoke to, the more Taiwanese they felt themselves. They didn't see any ambiguity about their nationality at all. When you spoke to older Taiwanese people, and I'm sure you know all this, but yeah, they could say, yeah, I'm of Chinese descent. I have Chinese ancestry. I feel very culturally Chinese. I didn't find any of that among people under 30, and I suspect that process has accelerated. Are Taiwanese leaders therefore worried about how long they can control and manage that sentiment?
Absolutely. I think one of the amazing phenomenon in Taiwan is how much the Taiwanese sense of identity has developed with democracy since 1996. And as a film out in the world now, we're part of a new wave of movies and books by Taiwanese, by the diaspora, about Taiwanese identity and the importance of it. I wish Taiwan and its leaders were more valued by governments around the world, because, in fact, they should be leading the conversation about their own future, about what they want for their democracy, how they would like to hold on to their way of life. And if they were valued in that way by leaders in the United States, in China, they should be allowed to negotiate their future diplomatically, but they need equal status with China, and they don't have it. The power imbalance is huge. China will win in any conventional war scenario with Taiwan, with the United States. That is why this is a World War III scenario. If something is triggered, other countries in the region will be involved. And so how to support Taiwan in the international community, not simply the United States, to allow it to negotiate on equal footing with China so that it can negotiate the future that it wants for itself.
You referred earlier to the incident of the young Taiwanese pop star being made to appear in what does look like a hostage video, confessing her sins for waving her national flag. And the film does also contain several other reminders of just China's extraordinary pettiness, where any expression of Taiwanese national identity is concerned. There are a couple of people who appear in the film lamenting the fact that when they go to the Olympic Games, they cannot call their country by its name, they cannot fly their own flag, etc. All that being the case, are you expecting any kind of reaction from China, or have you had any kind of reaction from China to the film you've made, which I don't think is going to be prompting queues round the block in the picture houses of Beijing?
Interestingly, when Chinese people see the film, and we've had probably a few Chinese people in almost every audience, they love it. They don't know Taiwan's story on this level, and they find it inspiring, which almost makes me want to cry. It's heartbreaking because it's not as if China hasn't had brilliant democratic leaders or people who have tried to push for democracy in China, human rights, all of it. I mean, the names are coming to mind immediately. I won't go down that route, but it is upsetting that the Chinese Communist Party is so powerful, and especially because of their market. I knew going in, distribution would be difficult. Major corporations, the global streaming platforms wouldn't likely want to take a risk. This is where, unfortunately, we feel the pushback. It's, of course, we did take precautions because of hacking and all the rest. And we have certain digital security in place, and team members have actually chosen to use pseudonyms so that they don't jeopardize the careers of Chinese filmmakers they're working with. But it's sad that when you look at what's happening in the United States today, we don't have a stronger sense of the importance of democracy and of telling stories of democracies like Taiwan's, where they've transitioned out of a military dictatorship and authoritarianism. It's such a lesson, especially right now, actually, for the United States. But everywhere, pushback, yes, but the film is getting out there. It's finding its audience. It's engaging with audiences in very emotional, meaningful ways where Taiwanese diaspora really are testifying to their own personal experiences that they haven't felt, seen, and heard before, and they want to share. It's such an impressive history, really. And there's so much resilience there that we really, especially again in the United States, we need to learn from.
Venessa Hope, director of Invisible Nation, thank you for joining us. The film can be seen from December in the UK and the US. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota, Lily Austin and Chris Chermak, with editing assistance from Flynn Simons. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Chris at cc@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mueller, thank you for listening. Until next time, goodbye.